Good morning, everyone. Kira? My name is Alice Chang Richards. This year's NHC Natural Hazards Commission Toka to Ake Keynote speaker. We have Dr. Laurie Johnson from Laurie Johnson Consulting to give a talk on earthquake resilient infrastructure. So I have known Laurie for more than 10 years. Just now we were even talking about how we met. So I have to mention I was doing my PhD in Christchurch after the Canterbury earthquakes, and then I got a phone call from Dave Bronston, said, Alice, there's a lady I really want you to meet in the town. So here's Laurie. In the disaster recovery and risk management space, Laurie has been the absolute go-to person. And she has been an excellent disaster recovery expert, a great mentor, and also a very dear friend to many of us sitting here. So therefore, indeed, it's really my great honor and my pleasure to introduce Laurie. Laurie is an internationally recognized urban planner, specialized in disaster recovery and catastrophe risk management. For over 35 years, she has very unique expertise in earth science, urban planning, and public policy to help communities, the insurance industry, and other organizations address the very complex challenges posed by natural hazards and disasters. Laurie was the president of the EERI, Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, from 2019 to 2022. Between 2012 and 2018, she chaired the U.S. Advisory Committee for the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program. She currently chairs the advisory board for the Global Earthquake Model Foundation. At the 50th anniversary of the ATC Applied Technology Council in December 2023, I was very fortunate to be there to witness that Laurie received the ATC Award of Excellence for extraordinary achievement in improving multi-hazard assessment of lifeline system performance. Also last year, she received the EERI Alfred E. Alquist Special Recognition Medal for her extensive work and dedication in improving the seismic safety and resilience of communities around the world. So please join me to welcome Laurie.
I apologize. I actually have caught a cold, which I seem to do when I come to New Zealand. There isn't a place to put this. Maybe I'll just set it down here, just in case. Hopefully, I heard that the last government took some of the really good drugs off the market, but that they're back on, and I was able to get some yesterday, so I'm feeling a little bit better. So I want to share with you sort of 3 case studies today. I initially thought about 2, and I added 1 in after the LA fires. So first I want to talk about the work we've been doing at the national level to develop lifeline functional recovery standards. So really this is the piece accompanying our efforts on the building side in the United States. And then I'll talk a little bit about our ongoing work in San Francisco to upgrade all of our infrastructure. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the fires and then pull out and give the big picture of what I think this all means. 1971, there was an earthquake in Los Angeles, the San Fernando earthquake, that damaged a lot of infrastructure, dams, hospitals, roadways, and it was at that time that really the Lifeline earthquake engineering community was born in the United States. Over the next 2 decades, the Technical Council on Lifeline Earthquake Engineering, a division of the American Society of Civil Engineers, who really kind of led the charge, and there's a group of professionals that have been involved from that very early stage to now. Doing earthquake reconnaissance with a focus on lifeline earthquake engineering and developing a number of monographs, and you can find all of that information on the American Society of Civil Engineers website. We also passed the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Act in 1977, and that really designated 4 national agencies to focus on the earthquake problem: our Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which leads a lot of our building standards development, and the National Science Foundation, as well as the U.S. Geologic Survey. And it was really the funding from the NSF and the NIST that supported lifelines, and FEMA as well, over those next 2 decades. But it never was a focus of those agencies in the same level that buildings have been. And so actually, well, I do want to go back to that slide and just say these are some workshops that I happened to go to in 1995 after the Kobe earthquake, and later I will show you where Dave Hopkins is located on those photographs, and you can see a young Dave Hopkins. But it was incredible to go and see the damage of lifeline infrastructure in Kobe. They opened the doors to us and even took us up to the top of the Akashi Kaikyo Bridge that was being built at the time, which, I can't imagine in the United States with all our liability concerns that they would ever allow a group of international people to do. So it was quite an experience. Very exciting moment in the mid-90s when the American Society of Civil Engineering came together with FEMA to form the American Lifeline Alliance. And a lot of work was done over the next 5 or 6 years until FEMA ran into financial problems and defunded the project. But it really did pull together a synthesis of all the different types of, kind of came up with consensus of which lifelines do we care about, what are pulling together all the standards that we had on their construction, both at a system level and at a component level, and for their performance. But as I said, we sort of again haven't really had that same synergy that the building side of our resilience work in the U.S. has had. And after ALA ended in 2005, we kind of went into a lull. It was really Hurricane Katrina that began to raise concern at a federal level around lifeline systems, and then also Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which led President Obama, president at the time, to actually issue a climate resilience directive that included lifelines and gave direction to NIST to undertake that. So we had the NEHRP structure in place, and we now had NIST saying, okay, I've got to do something about lifelines. There was also work that was going on to take the concept of performance-based engineering done at a building level and apply it at a community level. So we did this first in San Francisco in 2009 with something we called the Resilient City Initiative, where we set performance objectives for neighborhoods and different kinds of neighborhood functions. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but that went on to be used in Oregon as well, and there was an Oregon resilience plan. And then out of that, as NIST had this new responsibility, it said, let's try that and put something together at the national level. So the Community Resilience Planning Guide for Buildings and Infrastructure Systems is essentially that, and interesting to look at, because as you can see in the green, yellow, and blue boxes, really what it's saying is different kinds of neighborhoods, commercial districts, residential districts, critical hubs for infrastructure such as hospitals or campus-style facilities have to have different performance levels. They need to restore at different rates, and really has led that was the birth of us thinking about functional recovery and thinking of the integration spatially of buildings and infrastructure together. At the same time, we on the earthquake side did an earthquake resilience lifelines roadmap. And I just want to call out what we said was really topic number one after we debated all the things that needed to be done, was to develop an overarching framework that cut across all kinds of different lifeline systems, but set some performance objectives and restoration goals. And that became our focus for the next body of work that we've really been trying to address that charge. How do we set lifeline performance and restoration goals? And the challenge is that lifelines are really, these are complex distributed systems built over time. They're really designed and managed at the component level, not necessarily at the system level. And they have a lot of vulnerabilities because they're going over different types of soil structures and environments. And so it makes it a real challenge to look also at different kinds of systems, our electrical overhead telecommunication systems versus maybe the buried systems that more typically liquid natural gas, water, wastewater, et cetera. So as a follow-on to some of that work, NIST funded a study that I led called Critical Assessment of Lifeline System Performance, Understanding Societal Needs. And this is really where we were trying to get at what are performance expectations of society. So we looked around, we had 5 different types of systems that we were looking at: electric power, water, wastewater, telecom, transportation, gas, and liquid fuels. We summarized all the codes and standards that exist in the country in those different categories. We had sort of an expert for each. And then we also looked at societal considerations as best we could. And really, there was a dearth of research available. It's something that we just have not focused on from a research point of view. And we really wanted to understand, even in post-disaster environments across different kinds of hazards, because this was a multi-hazard assessment, what really had been understood and documented. And besides that TEACLI research, there was very little, and especially on how it affected society. How were the lifeline restorations a factor in a community's ability to recover or to take care of its people in the immediate aftermath? We have a number of different conclusions in here that a great majority of lifeline performance standards relate to normal day-to-day functions and don't cover performance during hazard events. There's a lack of consistency across performance requirements, unequal treatment of hazard. So what's the standard for hurricane is not the standard for flooding, for earthquake. That there was an emphasis on the component level, as I mentioned, instead of the systems level. And really that we had to think more in an interconnected systems way. And we needed a way to link together the component-based views with an overall system level performance target. And we need some models and modeling capability to do all this. And we also needed to improve communications with emergency managers and others who really don't understand what the expectation, what the reality is of systems and their performance after events, and are setting often unrealistic expectations. And so at that moment, I just want to make a call out. We've had some exchange here in New Zealand. Richard Mole and Dave Brunsden and the Lifeline Utilities Group down in Wellington have been doing some very interesting work in this called the Planning Levels of Service, where they are really trying to get at connecting the performance of lifeline systems, those expectations for how they're going to perform in a Wellington earthquake event, for example, with the emergency management community. And so some of the stuff I'm going to talk about now is connected to, we have shared thinking on some of these topics. As you may know, you're thinking about functional recovery, so are we. So our report in 2020 by FEMA and NIST, a joint report, those two collaborating, really called out, a number of things that have to be done for both buildings and infrastructure. But again, this notion of a framework for post-earthquake reoccupancy and functional recovery objectives applied not just to buildings, but also to lifelines. And the recommendation 4 was specific to design, upgrade, and maintain lifeline infrastructure systems to meet recovery-based objectives. So 2 projects have been ongoing since that time. All of this has been led by the Applied Technology Council, something that I hope, I know there's been some talk of creating here in New Zealand, and I hope that today I can convince you of why that's important. And so there are 2 reports that we've developed, or a series of reports, each have a couple of actual different reports to them. One by FEMA and one by NIST. So I'll just take you through those quickly. So we've really struggled with this challenge of these component designed systems, and how do you sort of zoom out, integrate, and come up with system level performance targets for recovery. And so the FEMA project is not yet published, and I'll say, given what's going on with our government, I don't know if it will get published, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you want. But I've spent most of my time this past week talking about the situation in America. But this project was really to sort of set the stage of the framework process. So we agreed we were not ready to set objectives. Let me just back up and say that. We don't have the ability at this point, with all the data and the research that we did, to say, okay, here's the standard and here's we're gonna go about do it. So what we decided to do was to develop a process that operators or jurisdictions or even national agencies could use to evaluate the current condition of systems and then set recovery time objectives for performance of different lifeline systems. So our charge from FEMA was to develop a comprehensive, transparent, reproducible process for identifying those target lifeline infrastructure system service recovery times after an earthquake, to document the process in the form of a framework and apply the framework to a water system example. So that's what you get in the 2 volumes of the FEMA document. So here's the philosophy and how it works. The first idea is that you really need to break the system down into its basic services. So we're doing a lot of talk about this on the functional recovery side for buildings as well. What are the basic intended functions of a building? So we're saying, what are the basic services that a different system provides? And I'll give you an example on water, and this applies to many systems. There's the quantity of the service. There's the quality of the service. Those are different. They're not, you can actually provide some level of service with quantity even if you don't have quality. So we tried to sort of zoom out for each of these systems and think about what those basic services are. Then think about the user types. And this kind of goes back to that idea of kind of clustering buildings, neighborhoods, functions together. But you have users that have different importance levels and capabilities. And so we know that we need, like for firefighting, for example, that's a very specific user on water. A hospital has very specific uses. So go through an exercise of actually identifying and creating user typologies, then bringing those 2 things together in the context of different events. And here where we're going with this is really sort of the same idea of sort of different levels, risk categories or levels of events, where you are looking at really, that the impact of that, the level of damage you're expecting, the likely outage duration if nothing is done, and then how can you actually look at what should be done given those users and those intended functions to better mitigate and be ideal in addressing the performance at those different levels. So the FEMA framework has sort of 7 steps. First, identifying all those key elements that I just described, and then going through and conducting individual assessments of determining like the consequences for these different users, for these different functions, and then out of that sort of aggregating all that up and looking at how you can manage those assets, both from a construction or a mitigation point of view, sort of the asset-based work, but also we recognize with lifelines, probably more than buildings, we had to account for adaptation. It's just no way that these systems can be completely, as complex as they are, as distributed as they are, we have to have, I guess I would say, sort of fail safely. So making adaptations and organizational actions more a part of the framework and more a part of the design. And this is interesting because it links up emergency management, but it also links up to the long-term capital plans and business resumption plans that utilities already do. But it makes it more explicit. that, if we're not going to have potable water, we've got to plan for the potable water, but we can guarantee the quantity of water. So once you get to that, you come up with your recovery time objectives with your two pieces, the asset expectations and the adaptation expectations for different systems. Here's an example. Sorry, I think I'm a little behind on the slides. Here's an example on the basic recovery objectives for water for different levels of earthquake. So as I mentioned, you've got the basic intended function of just delivering the water, so getting it from the transmission part of the system to the distribution part of the system. Then looking at quality and quantity. And in the end, we ended up pulling fire suppression out because it is so unique. And in some places, like San Francisco, we actually have a separate system where we're trying to provide high pressure water for firefighting, and we're not as concerned about quality of that water as we are quantity. So all the service descriptions are defined, and then we go through and work out for the different levels what the expectations are for the system restoration. So, we have a series of days, essentially, for different level events and different basic intended services. This all feeds at the top of it into the NIST framework, which is available and got out in time. And really what it does is you bring those recovery time objectives into a much more detailed analysis. This is where the design work now happens, of actually working through the details of the asset framework, which has 11 steps or something, and the adaptation framework. And so you keep iterating on that till you get to the point that you actually have a complete design of organizational actions that have to happen and asset-related mitigations that have to happen in order for that system to meet those recovery time objectives. The second volume of the NIST report actually uses a product called NCORE, which is kind of like RiskScape a little bit, to actually model this through in the hypothetical city that NCORE works within. So it's quite interesting to see that actual case study. So what do we feel this is doing for us in terms of an advance? Well, initially focused on earthquakes, these frameworks really can be applied to any other hazard. And I've been thinking about them a lot with respect to the LA fires, and we're hoping that we actually might squeeze some money out of one agency to do some research on the LA fires that looks at how these frameworks how we can use that as a case study. The processes apply to all lifeline infrastructure systems, both the physical infrastructure and the organizational actions for the owners that operate them. It helps establish consistent objectives that are performance-based for every component of the system. So we're homogenizing what right now is not consistent, where a generator has a much higher level of performance than actually a substation or some other field-related component. It allows for adaptations, as I mentioned, as part of performance criteria. And it's also linking up the emergency responders and can make that planning process more seamless. And it provides a common method for developing service recovery time objectives for infrastructure systems, which can also feed into the functional recovery objectives and inform the functional recovery objectives, and at least understanding for the building side as well. So all of that is really good for community resilience, in our view. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about San Francisco. We had the 1906 earthquake. We had uncontrollable fires in large part because we lost pressure in our water system and were unable to fight those fires. In 1989, we dodged a bullet. We had fires break out across the city, but it was a very calm evening. You can see I used that picture at the beginning. You can see the smoke plume coming up from the Marina District, just going straight up into the air, which is right at the west side of the city at the Golden Gate, which is a wind tunnel, essentially, at a macro scale for the Bay Area. And it was evening time when we typically have a pretty strong wind of at least 10 knots. And we had nothing that night. It was a very still night. And we've had firefighters say that, if we had not been able to, the water system was high highly damaged if we had not been able to pull in water from the bay. We have an overland firefighting capacity with 2 water boats, big tugboats that pump water out of the bay. And the Marina District was close to the bay. But they have said on recollection that half the city would have burned in 1989. So this is in our ethos. It's definitely in the psyche of lifeline utility operators in San Francisco. And so here, this is too complicated to read all of it, but I like to just show that I feel, and have been charting since 2006, the work that's been going on sort of in 3 pathways in San Francisco. One has been on improving the resilience of our built environment, which is largely built out. So this is a massive retrofit program. And then the bottom one is what's happened on the lifeline side. And the middle one is governance. And so I'm going to weave together these things for you. I think the scenario that we did in 2006 was a game changer. Not only did we produce a pretty full-scale scenario that talked about and showed the building damage levels being, loss ratios being incredibly high in San Francisco because of the older building stock, the oldest building stock west of the Mississippi in the United States. The other thing we saw is really with HAZUS, our sort of Riskscape type software, we really couldn't do a good estimate of fire following, and we couldn't do a good estimate of lifelines. So we had to just basically convene some expert panels and make a guess. So we came up with the number of $150 billion loss, and it caught political attention. It was also really good timing because Hurricane Katrina had happened in the United States, and politicians, now Governor Newsom, who was mayor at the time, really took notice of that, really identified that San Francisco is a community of neighborhoods. It has a lot of culture tied to its different neighborhoods, very similar to New Orleans. So these things kind of came together. And we caught the attention of a public policy think tank that exists in San Francisco SPUR. None of us were members of that. Us EERI people, we called ourselves, sort of the earthquake community, the earthquake professionals. The director of SPUR came to us and said, we want to form a committee, but we want to bring you, some policy people, people in real estate, people who work in various government labor unions, all of these different people that were part of SPUR, and let's talk about this problem together. And that's where this performance-based community sort of scale concept came to be. We struggled with this. This was a 3-year project of where we really struggled with what were we doing, and would it be something we could implement, and came up with this idea of performance-based criteria on a neighborhood level. So at the top, we said, you have to have things that are critical infrastructure to the community, return more quickly than neighborhood-serving uses, which need to, we need to keep our people in our community. We can't lose them, so housing was second. And lastly was commercial. And out of this, really, we had recommendations for what had to happen with existing buildings, but also new buildings, because we recognized deficiency in the existing code, and then also infrastructure. One of our recommendations was to follow something that you do through the CDMAC, which is to have these lifeline utility groups. So we actually recommended that the city create a Lifelines Council. We are asked, San Francisco is asked all the time, how do you do it? How do I set one up? We still don't have another Lifelines Council in America that I'm aware of. And we are now, 15 years on. We meet quarterly. It continues today. In the beginning, mostly what happened was we brought together executives of all the utilities operating in the city. So some of these are regional, even statewide, almost statewide, like Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E. And some are actually very city-focused. But we brought together executives. We were able to get high-level people there because now Governor Newsom, mayor then, said, I'm committing to this. And for the first year, what we did on those quarterly meetings was just have each company just shared what they were doing. What was the status of their system? Had they looked at mitigation? What were they investing in resilience? And then we realized after about 2 or 3 years, we had to do something else. And so what we actually set about doing then was what we called an interdependency study. No, I'm having some problems here. It's not displaying the full. Yeah, it's locked. While these guys figure it out, I'll just explain. So we did an interdependency study, and then that led to something called the Lifeline Restoration Performance Project. So these two projects together and I led the interdependency study. At first, everyone talked about sharing data. Utilities have a very hard time sharing data. There are physical, terrorist, risks that are very, very real. They don't want that data in the public realm. Having me as a consultant involved kept at least the conversations a little bit at arm's length from government, but it wasn't enough assurance. And so what we did was actually take God, I compressed it too. It's not that big a file. We actually took the work that Keith Porter, who you might know, has done the Mitigation Saves projects. He had actually done some work on a scenario in Southern California, the shakeout scenario, where he did a qualitative analysis. But he did that in a very structured way, where we started with sort of the most dependent or sort of the most foundational lifeline systems first. We asked questions based on a scenario around their performance. Let's see if we can get to it now. And then so in a different scenario, what would their performance be? And then as we progressed through different lifeline systems, we did a second round of discussion, which was around now that you told me what you expect your system to do, now we're going to tell you about the dependencies of other systems, and now reset your expectations. So that study actually really showed for the first time to many of the operators how interdependent they actually were, and that they didn't have contingencies for these interdependencies. We also showed that in terms of restoration timelines and the dependencies that some had. In San Francisco, we have a very hard time installing batteries on our cell towers because of the views, and views are so politically important. And so we didn't have backup generators on much of the telecommunication system. So while there was some supply of backup generation for those systems, it would basically be gone within 24 to 36 hours. And so they were inextricably tied to restoration of electricity. We also found that turning off gas and relighting our piped gas system was going to take months. Because of the way the system was structured, they couldn't at the time isolate different parts of the system, so they just had to shut the entire city off. And so that made it really complicated for turning it back on. The 2020 study also was a qualitative study, and it basically gave much more refined view and really focused on that performance in the post-disaster period. And the Lifeline Council is now updating this study with its members. One of the things that the 2014 study did, and this is just one example of the insights that came out of this work, was that we highlighted where there were choke points in the city, where multiple mainline trunk lines were co-located. After the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, we had a lot of damage to our freeway structures. One of those ran right along our waterfront. When we tore that down and decided to open up the waterfront, the city also made a decision to basically open up the ground and let everybody put their main line into that corridor and upgrade their mainline systems. So everybody was located right along the waterfront, what we call the Embarcadero that runs around the bay. And right next to that is a seawall that was built over time, some of which was engineered, some was not, going back to the 1850s when San Francisco was first developed. So the vulnerability of the seawall was something the Port of San Francisco knew a lot about, but nobody was listening. And when we got the utility operators involved in the discussion and everybody began to recognize all the assets that went through or were abutted by and protected by that seawall, everything changed. The 2020 study also continued to emphasize and put pressure on this issue, and the operators were able to say, look, we really depend on this, and we need this addressed. And so I'm pleased to report, and I think it's really interesting, that voters have gone along with this as well. A $425 million bond was passed by voters in 2018. But the port basically took the approach at that point in time, not just to address the earthquake vulnerabilities, but to also address the ongoing flood-related vulnerabilities as well as future flood risk. And for many of us, we didn't want that distraction and wanted to keep the eye focused on the earthquake problem, but it really made it much more sellable to the public. And I think it's just a point I really want to emphasize. As we deal with the uncertainty of the future, we have to make relationships with people working in the other hazards. And we have a lot to teach them. So a key piece in this that was also started back in 2005, 2006 was a capital planning program. You guys have your district plans and your long-term plans, is that right? We don't have that in America. So a lot of cities actually don't. They have capital improvement plans, but they're generally about 2 years to 5 years in length. They're basically saying, oh, here's our plan for development. What do we need to support that in terms of infrastructure, and what's the city's cost for that? But the capital planning program said, hey, we have all these needs. We have this really old infrastructure in San Francisco. We're going to take a really long-term view. If bonds that we sell have 30-year lives, 20-year lives, we want our plan to be a revolving plan, updated every 2 years, but it's projecting and it's pulling together all those needs. And they made the body, the capital planning committee, the board of supervisors, like our city council and the mayor, got appointments, but also staff were on it. So our city chief finance officer and other key positions were on this capital planning committee. So it sort of neutralized the politics a bit out of this kind of discussion. What's interesting, you'll see in here are the earthquake safety and emergency response, I think that's what they're called, bonds, those 4 arrows that I have pointed out there. A lot of things got bundled up, and really that was the goal of this, was to move away from project-based capital financing to programmatic capital financing. So all of the fire stations that need to be upgraded are in this plan. The water system, both the transmission part of the system and the distribution part of the system have been in this plan. The sewer system is now being upgraded. Our auxiliary firefighting water system is being upgraded. And that's really been financed and achieved through this disciplined approach to capital planning. So we wouldn't have been able to get that work done without it. This is a report done in 2018 by the USGS, Tom Brocher and others, just documenting the amount of investment that's been made as best as we can document it in public records in San Francisco since the Loma Prieta earthquake. So $80 billion of investment. But if you see that pie chart on the left, that big blue piece, that's San Francisco County. So while San Francisco County is 1 million out of 7 million people, the investment there has been, huge and disproportionately large relative to the whole Bay Area. But it's also the oldest part of the Bay Area in Oakland. But by far, we're surpassing Oakland and other older cities in the Bay Area in terms of the investment. But I'll just say that we still have a long way to go. We know that in the city level, but also the American Society of Civil Engineers does a report card every year. I would also say that this is a very effective tool with politicians. We moved from a D- in like 2015 or something. We're up to a C nationwide. California is a C-, and what they say is that really the weather-related phenomena are impacting the systems and making the vulnerability of systems even greater. So if you're interested, you can go look at this report card. It's broken down by state and gives a lot of rationale. The other thing I'll note is the Inflation Reduction Act had a huge amount of investment in infrastructure projects passed by the Biden administration. And that really was one of the main reasons ASCE said we can actually give a C for the first time in decades and not a D. Nationwide because of all of those projects. So now I want to talk just briefly about the fires. So far, there were a number of fires that broke out on January 7th. It was a high wind event. So from a hazard point of view, the fire is not the focus. For a design point of view, the wind is the focus. There were 30 deaths, 16,000 structures, and a vast amount of land that was burned. Southern California Edison has now been accused and even admitted liability on one, but accused of two fires, causing two fires, their equipment causing two fires. This is a very large utility. It's the second largest in California. The other one is Pacific Gas and Electric, which is larger. It serves 50 million people, essentially. And we have started an adaptation that started back in the 2018 with PG&E of essentially, this is an adaptation. It's a very draconian one, but it's to essentially shut off the system. So we call these public safety power shutoffs. So when we get to the point of this high wind event, the reliability and the confidence that these operators have in the system is so low that they essentially shut off the systems. Now, PG&E is, in 2018, I believe it was, the entire Bay Area got shut off. 8 million people. There's no fire risk from wind in San Francisco. Most of the lines are undergrounded. But they didn't have a way to segmentize the system. So they've been investing a lot in basically segmentizing the system, and they can do a much more tailored shutoff now. But it still has led to, a huge amount of cascading effects for emergency planning. I went to the first Lifeline Council meeting after that when San Francisco had been shut off, and operators were furious. Cell operators, everybody, sewer system, they didn't know this was gonna happen. They had no forewarning, and so all those interdependencies that I showed you kicked in, and it was really a tough time politically for PG&E. So now it's a much more, specific kind of thing. But while PG&E filed an electric incident report for two fires, it's sort of, because of work I do on a financing mechanism for the utilities, you could read one of them and know that they were already accepting responsibility. But it was a small fire that really had no impact on structures. But the Eaton fire is one of the two largest fires. And this is a photograph that emerged after they had come out and said it wasn't our equipment was shut down. This photograph emerged, video emerged of some transmission towers on fire right around, or the fire being right around those transmission towers at roughly the same time the fire broke out. Those lines, some of the neighborhood was de-energized through the PSPS, but not all of it, and these transmission lines weren't de-energized. The PG&E said that their criteria for PSPS on transmission lines was over 60 miles an hour. Someone can do the math for me. But the wind was picking up that evening, and they were expecting the wind to go down. And so they hadn't actually sort of planned for these gusts that started in the evening hours. So we don't know. There's a lot of investigation going on. But I think it just really goes to the point of, what can we do with respect to asset performance, and then what do we have to do in terms of adaptations? There were more adaptations that could have been done, than were done if they had gone through some analysis. What's really interesting is that they're actually saying that this line was not the one where it looks like the fire started, somehow energized, that it wasn't even in use at the time. It's an older transmission tower. So it is a mystery in some ways. At least right now, we don't know what exactly happened. But these are next slides are from PG&E, Edison's business update as of October 24, so 4 months before this happened. And they're talking about, we have legislation we passed after the really large fires caused by Pacific Gas and Electric that caused them to go bankrupt. We passed legislation that allows the three utilities to pool their money into what we call the California Wildfire Fund. So it's a $20 billion fund. The state said, utilities have to capitalize half, and then we'll allow the ratepayers to pay for half of this over time. The Wildfire Fund is really a liability protection fund, so it's like an insurance pool. But the legislation also says that you have to have wildfire mitigation plans, and that you have to be complying with all of these regulations on investigating and reducing the risk of your equipment. And in order to access the fund, and if you're complying and acting in good practice, then you get a wildfire safety certificate every year, and that will allow you to access the fund. And it's a little complicated. It basically means different things for how much they would have to pay back the fund. Also, our state has been doing a lot in investing in fire suppression. So they were just documenting to shareholders and the public how these three things work together. The legislation, the regulation is keeping them accountable. The fund is there to provide them with a backstop financially. And then we also have all of this investment that the state has been making in fire suppression. They also went on to talk about all the work that they're doing. They've taken a strategy and analyzed their system and said that a thing called a covered conductor, it's basically going over the connections of lines to poles, was really where their biggest risk was. And so they've invested in that hardening and a number of other things, tree trimming, et cetera. And they even had RMS Moody's do an analysis and said that by installing all of these covered conductors, they'd reduce their overall risk by 85%. They also, sadly, said that this work would probably be completed by the end of 2025. As we think about functional recovery and we think about performance standards, I think that I just really want to drive the point around the need for adaptations because these systems are so complex. So here's an image of the transmission tower and the close-up of the area where the burn is on the tower. So, to wrap up, after looking at disasters across the world, my colleague and I, as he was about to retire, wrote a book, After Great Disasters. It was a case study of the Christchurch earthquakes in it, one of 6 countries that we looked at. We talked about 4 things from a recovery management point of view that governments and leaders who got these 4 things, understood how to work these 4 topics, did best in recovery. And there is no best, but I would say on a lifeline side, SCIRT is probably the best that we saw in our 6 countries cases. And that's really about managing money. It's about managing and utilizing information like a commodity, like money, because you can fuel the ecosystem of actors with information as much as you can with money. It's about collaboration because everything is perturbed and interdependent in recovery when you take certain things out of an environment. And collaborating is just going to inform what you need to do. And it's also about managing time, something we talk about called time compression after an event, where so much capital stock and services has been taken out of use that you're having to make more decisions in a much shorter time frame. You're having to act and construct in a much more constrained environment. But I would posit that those 4 things are also the things we need to be thinking about when it comes to resilience. And we need to be thinking about them all as levers that we can use, as commodities that we can interchange. So if we don't have one, let's try to emphasize the other. And I think that's for us as engineers and planners working in the standard space, we tend to focus on the information piece of this, but we need to recognize the collaboration piece and also how to be opportunistic and persistent and manage time and money. So, some final thoughts around money. I think reflecting back on what I talked about in our cases, I think the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Act has been critical. The money has never been what was Congress initially appropriated. The allocation is about 1/4 of what what was said we needed. But it helped set priorities. It has helped provide direction for the agencies and a political obligation of those agencies. I'd also say that our capital planning program in San Francisco has really kind of evened out the competition and the reaction of financing in a way that is much more disciplined. And our legislation for the electric utilities is working. It's just it didn't work well enough in the case of these fires. But it is the investments the utilities are now making, because they're not buying incredibly costly insurance every season, is huge. Public funding also helps justify and attract other public funds. So we see this after disasters. Even with these programs in place, like a retrofit program, we see the financing come in with our post-disaster funding too, and it's a lot easier to do if the regulations are already there. But also private and NGO funding. So our pro bono services that we do, we get recognized as professionals if we're contributing to some of these efforts, and our firms get recognized. And it also allowed for things like the Rockefeller Foundation to fund the 100 Resilient Cities, which you benefited for in a case. But the thing we've recognized too is that equitable is not equal, and that we really have to find ways to fund the most needy, the resource-constrained communities at different levels, and we can't take a one-size-fits-all. On collaboration, the sustained engagement, advocacy and partnerships between government, universities, the private sector, and the public is essential. And I would say ATC has been essential in America for us to get to where we've gotten. And they depend on funding from these federal agencies. NIBS, our National Institute of Building Sciences, was created by Congress to essentially do the work it does in helping set the building codes. But it depends on funding from Congress. And so, you know, we're at a turning point, essentially, in terms of what happens with these organizations. The Lifelines Council has been tremendous. And then, as I mentioned, the Capital Planning Program. One thing I want to say, in interviewing the Chief Resilience Officer, who also has led the Capital Planning Program from the beginning in San Francisco, he said, we took the unusual action in polling the public about what they wanted as we were looking to set the objectives of the program. And he said what was really important to people were the things that would directly impact them. Earthquakes were a big concern for the public, but sticking in safety and emergency response got more support than sticking in the word resilience. People don't relate to the word resilience as much. Collaboration. The functional recovery frameworks account for the asset resilience as well as the adaptations. And I think it's that holistic view, that fail-safe, that we need to think a lot more about. It doesn't have to all be engineered. There are ways in which we can protect people and protect assets and fail safer. The NIST workshop, we just did this for the building side, functional recovery, the report's in draft, but just two things I want to highlight. That the recovery time objectives for buildings need to reflect lifeline functionality and lifeline recovery timeframes. So when we invited in a group of recovery experts, the top names in America, to come and sit in a room for a day and talk about functional recovery, something they're not used to. Some of them do hurricane stuff, you know, all kinds of things. They couldn't break it apart. They couldn't talk about building performance on an individual building. They wanted to talk about it in a collective way, like we did with the Spur project, and they needed to know what was going on with the lifelines. The functional recovery and service assignments to the recovery objectives should be customizable for communities with minimal standards. So Wayne Brown said, you know, what happens here, there's a regional approach. I'm looking at Ken right now. You know, we need to take a more regional approach. That's what, you know, I think it's that idea of doing incremental and starting with where people are and where their communities are on this journey, and not trying to force, you know, the whole enchilada, the whole objective at the start. On informations, the standards and policy, and I know Jenny said, you know, the regulations, MBS didn't make a difference. I think I feel that they stimulate action, even if unfunded. It gives a guidepost. It gives a recognition of what the goal is, and can thus for help people understand what they're trying to go towards. Multi-hazard assessments, I think we need to get comfortable with this and can't just be thinking about earthquakes, especially as we move into a more rapidly changing environment. And risk terminology needs to be relatable, but we need to think about the treatment of uncertainty when we do it and consistency across hazards. We have so many different hazard levels for different events. It's mind-boggling to the public. We made a huge mistake in America going with the 100-year flood because it happens a lot more frequently than 100 years. So these are just words of caution. I've heard a lot of people here talk about the intolerable life safety risk as something they do not understand for a flood, because there could be adaptations that would allow their life safety to be protected. Warnings, and better communication emergency management. So they're having a hard time wrapping their head around that language. So I think we need to spend more time thinking about that. And one thing, you know, a guy, John Doerr, he's a big Silicon Valley venture capitalist. He wrote a book, Measure What Matters. He worked at Intel. I'm not into venture capital, but he just formed a school, the first school formed at Stanford in like 50 years. So I wanted to understand who he was and read his book. And he talks a lot about basically, you know, setting goals and objectives within an organization that it aligns everybody towards those goals. And his point was that transparency seeds collaboration. And I think it's that transparency when we sort of bundle things up under these objectives and people don't understand where they're coming from, or we talk about things at the building envelope level rather than the component level, or at the system level rather than the component level. It's hard to relate and it's hard to address. And scenarios and past disaster studies, qualitative as well as quantitative studies, can get us there. I really didn't think we would get as far as we did with the interdependency study, being so qualitative as we did. Lastly, about time, functional recovery standards for lifelines and buildings are placing greater emphasis on time, but time, especially if you're looking at it post-disaster, is messy. And we need to really be careful when we measure one recovery from one disaster from another. Was it insured? What was the capacity of that government to deal with that recovery? You know, I have so many people say to me, oh, well, you know, LA has the same amount of houses damaged as the Paradise Fire in 2018. And it's taken Paradise, they've only got like 2,000 houses rebuilt out of those 18,000. Paradise did 200, 300 building consents a year. It's a tiny place. The whole town was wiped out. You can't compare that with Los Angeles, which is high capacity. You've got a ton of resources right there ready to go. So we have to understand context. We have to understand place. We have to understand culture. And this notion of time compression, I think slow it down a little bit, but it exists with resilience. It's a long game. We have to be persistent, but we also have to be opportunistic. And we need to know how to manage time in that way. As Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. I want to commemorate this lecture to David Johnston. At his funeral, many people talked about how David was always advocating for recognizing past events, communicating those to the next generations about historic tsunamis and earthquakes and other events. He's been involved with a number of the scenario projects. I think David was a master of those four things as I started thinking about it. He found money where I never knew money existed. He was great at collaborating across disciplines, and he also knew how to leverage information and drive it to the right person. So, as I said, I dedicate this lecture to him, and I hope we all remember him fondly. Thank you. And I see that I use most of my time, and I'm sorry for that.
So the next keynote speaker, San Diego, actually decided. So they're going to actually have Q&A together because suggested. Okay, cool. So, so Laurie, are you okay for the Q&A after San Diego's speech?
Thank you.
Okay, cool. So